I I was called like a few weeks ago. Jeff Brinkman had asked me to say something or to talk on last month's meeting, Sarah meeting, St. Paul Sarah's meeting. But that day I was, or the day before, I was traveling from Africa, so I said I will not be able to do it, and I proposed another wonderful priest, Father Fan, to come and speak with you. I think he did a wonderful job, a great one. And then suddenly, out of the blue, Jeff calls me and says, you know what, with Debbie, we have decided that when we meet on 1st of July, so you will have to speak on that day. My very first reaction was no. Yeah, and then I got a letter from Debbie, and for whoever knows Debbie, who can say no to Debbie? So I kind of felt a little ashamed if I had to say no to Debbie. Again, I would like to tell you that if this thing is not properly prepared, and if you don't catch anything out of this, blame it on Debbie. Not on me. One of the reasons why I did not want to talk about it, actually, what she told me, and I think I verified, was to speak about redeeming sufferings. So I said no. One of the reasons is this, because we cannot define what suffering is. We need to have experienced it to know what it is. And I have experienced it in so many ways that I did not feel that it was appropriate anyway to talk about it. But it is not only because of that. Another thing is that speaking about suffering and redemption, or as a Christian and a priest, I see kind of the two that are not always, are not two things that we can put together in a way. Or even though during this talk, I will try to see with the help of the Bible and with the help of our Saint John Paul II to put some things together. All of us, we know that suffering is a very challenging concept to grapple. It is difficult to define, and if you have suffered, and I bear in myself the marks of unbearable suffering, you do not want to speculate about it. It is experience, and sometimes, because it is suffering, crucifying experience. Then the few reflections here will explain why I almost said no to Debbie. Finally, if any of you here, I thought that I will be able to speak in a way that will make these two concepts, suffering and redemption, come together in a way that is understandable to you, I think my conclusion to this talk will disappoint you. And that conclusion is taken on one side from the last chapter of the book of Job, and also, most importantly, from the example of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Submission to the unfathomable will of God will be my conclusion. Let's start then with creation, because we are Christians and we come to talk about suffering and redemption. When you open the Bible, Genesis, the very first thing that you see, it is about creation. And if you read it, you will see that the writer is speaking about everything that God has created. And he concludes continuously, and God saw that everything was good. It doesn't come one time. It comes continuously. almost 7 times. After every creation, it shows that God put everything in motion in a very harmonious way. There was no suffering in what he created. So God created everything in a way that everything was perfect. No suffering but joy, and nothing that will interrupt that happiness that the very first creation, Adam and Eve, enjoyed. It might explain somehow why we all of us, we see in suffering and not welcomed, interruption of our pursuit of happiness. We fight it. If you don't, I do. We fight suffering. We repress it. We medicate it. Or we search sometimes for some quick fix solutions to get rid of it. Those are things I have experienced, and I think that in this August audience, many have certainly experienced that too. The perfect and harmonious creation of the first chapter of Genesis was short-lived. Already by the 3rd chapter, we see that the harmony is interrupted by the disobedience of Adam and Eve. What followed is life's impermanence and imperfection, defeats and disappointments, and even murder. The very first sin, beyond the disobedience of Adam and Eve, was a murder. Cain murdered his one brother Abel. So that was the way sin and suffering entered in the world. Suffering then became an inevitable part of our human life on earth. We experience it throughout our lives. Even kids, they do. Actually, I was in hospital. It happened so many times that I was called where they will be delivering kids, and the deacon there who has worked for so long in hospital certainly knows what it is. And sometimes you get there and you see this child who has come just being born is completely deformed. And the parents are really shocked to see that they were not expecting it. Even as science has so much evolved, and say, how come this child is almost half an animal? And that's the thing that you said, not only the parents, but the child also is suffering. It has become part of our human life. We experience it all the time. The everyday challenges, physical injury, hurt feelings, and much deeper suffering in the loss of a loved one, profound loneliness, betrayals, and even having to face our own mortality with terminal illness. I tell you, in hospitals, and that's mostly where I kind of face it every single day. And sometimes I will go home and I will not sleep, angry myself with God. Why, Lord? Why? The kind of sufferings that you see and people going through, say, why will God do these kind of things? And sometimes you go there and I'm prepared to pray with the people who are suffering, and then you get there, you are speechless. You cannot speak. What am I going to say? And yet, I probably know that God loves this person. But you have that kind of very deep anger saying, it's impossible, and I will probably explain it a little more in this not very organized talk. So, how did the Old Testament, because we speak about the scripture, react to suffering? or the very first reaction, due to the fact that God really and truly, he punished our forefathers. And then they said, suffering is caused by sin. That's the way they understood it. For them, suffering is the just punishment of sin. And there are many examples in the Bible for the people of Israel that they consider that's how it is. We can remember Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm not going to get into all the issues that we have now in our nation above, everything about what God allowed and what God did not allow. But anyway, God punished the people of Sodom and Gomorrah according to the Bible because of the sin that they had committed. Women with women, man with man was not in the plan of God, according to the Bible. I'm not going to get into speculations that have become too political here. I am just talking about what the Bible said. So they are punished, was that. And you know, David, because of his sin, the child born by the woman died, and the prophet Nathan said it was because of his sin. We know the exile of the people of Israel, that the exile, the fact that they were submitted to the orders, it was again the punishment of God, the sufferings because of the rebellion and the sins. This view is not only in the Bible, not Old Testament, even the New Testament. You certainly remember these words of Paul and Peter, and that John is kind of relating to us, when they saw this man who was blind by birth, and then they turned to Jesus and say, who sinned, he or his parents? He is blind, and for them, it is somebody in the family had sinned. And Jesus did not say that it was for that. The same Old Testament especially is still also struggling with another aspect of it, is suffering always a just punishment of sin. Isaiah, for example, the third book of Isaiah, is speaking about the just servant of the Lord who is suffering. And the sufferings that he is bearing is not his own sufferings. That was the very first time, or maybe among one of the first time they're asking themselves, is always suffering just punishment for sin? It is actually much more elaborated in the book of Job. And I'm taking a little longer than I had been given, but I am going to probably go quickly now. Yeah. Again, if you remove the very first chapter of Job, and you remove the last chapter of Job, then you find out the very much questions that the people of Israel was asking themselves. They say, how can we explain an innocent who suffers? He has done nothing wrong. So it cannot absolutely not be, the just punishment of the sin. And we see in that book of Job, it's quite long, the book of Job, but it is worth actually being read. Put in your mind, remove the very first chapter to understand what is happening here. So Satan, the power of evil in the world, has destroyed Job's possessions and family, everything that he enjoyed, wealth, a good family, everything. But it is not only just. Troubles actually multiply. And then his body is covered with malignant ulcers from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. To relieve his itching and pain, Job scrubs his sores and sits in ashes. Again, if we could explain what it means to sit in ashes and so on, it will be taking a long time. And then his friends are coming to visit with him. And when they see, to offer him sympathy and consolation. When they catch sight of him, they are repulsed and appalled at what they see. I think you have found yourself in that situation when you get into a hospital or somebody, you look at your loved one and say, that's not the person I know. And that's what happened with Job. They look at him and say, no, it's impossible. And they go even further. Even his own wife, curse God and die. You know, we are in hospital. You see, sometimes people say, I can't take it anymore. I want to die once for all. Let me go. Let me go. And that's what they are telling him. Say, curse God and die. Because, not because they don't love him, because they see that the sufferings are unbearable. Or if we could go into knowing so many of those situations we have found that way, we know that Job is not just an idea 5,000, 6,000 years ago, but it is a reality of our world even today. And then God, he is there, he is not saying anything, but because of what he sees and so on, he finally breaks the silence with a great lament. He cursed his day, the circumstances of his life. Perish the day on which I was born. Why did I not perish at birth? Or go into hospitals. We see many of them will say, no, there is no need. You know, sometimes somebody is depressed. Or depression comes also from that moment where you are in such a great suffering. You suffer so much and you become even a burden to your own family. And I see the situations in those hospitals where sometimes, and there you family is suffering and say, oh, no, your insurance can no longer cover you. Do you have anything left? Or do you want a home, or do you have some stocks and so on? Go and sell it, then we can continue to heal you. And so many families lost everything because of the loved one, and yet they don't manage to get that person back to health. Oh, Job is not alone in that situation. Suffering changes and challenges us in different ways. As we sit like Job in ash pit of trauma and trouble, we can't let suffering do its work on us, blind us to the presence of God. We can't let it force us into different ways of seeing and thinking. We get very lonely, very, very lonely. Even when you have your family around you, you are, because anyway, no one, no matter what, can feel what you feel, can go into the depth of your suffering. But they said, but Job did not curse God. And that's probably will begin my second part of it. We must have to realize this, and I come to the first chapter of Job, which some theologians say that it is an addition that came later on. It says that it is not God who is punishing Job, and that's what we know. But God let Satan, test the faith of Job. This is an interpretation of finally to say that if suffering there is in the world, it doesn't come from God. It is going back again to that. It might be a punishment for our sins. And naturally, it does not, again, give an answer to the main question is what and how do we explain the suffering of an innocent man? How is it that God was good and a loving God, God who has created us for life and not for death, accept that suffering be into the world? And then here I'm going to go to the apostolic letter of our Holy Father John Paul II in 1984, which was in Latin called Salvifici Doloris, which can be translated on the meaning of Christian suffering. In this encyclical, John Paul highlights the fact that suffering is a universal, even an essential human experience. It is something that we all must struggle with at various points in our lives, and it leads us to ask why we are going through a painful experience. He goes on saying, Christ's passion, send us to Christ. Christ suffered. He suffered for us. And if he did suffer for us, he suffered so that he can give a meaning to our suffering. And Christ's passion, he said, saved the world. And yet, his passion also applies to us. Patiently suffering the toils and tribulation God may wish to send us, make us becoming closer to his Son Jesus Christ. Therefore, through our sufferings, embraced with faith, we are conformed to Christ. Thus, what was useless and destructive becomes something of incalculated value. Then physical suffering, pain, illness, if borne with Christ, receive a redemptive value. Coming back again to what Debbie asked, then how does suffering becomes a redeeming suffering? It has to be lived by remaining closer to God. It said, if in our sufferings we do not lose hope, and we keep our sight focused on Christ, then we become co-sufferers with Christ. And that is also in the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, which Holy Father also quote abundantly in his encyclical, saying, he said, if we die, if we suffer with Christ, then we will triumph. And if we die with Christ, and then we will live. The Father calls, the Holy Father also quotes another part of the letter of St. Paul, in which he said that I am completing and fulfilling in my own body what is lacking to the suffering of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. Well, I could go on. There are many other things that he says, but I'm going to make it short, so if there are questions, we can answer those questions. One of the things that the Holy Father insists upon is that time of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's crying. If you read it, especially in Mark, it is, and read it very well. He said he is crying so much. He said, Father, take this away from me. No, take it away from me. And the writers say that he is sweating so much that the sweat became blood. And you can understand at one point what kind of suffering he was enduring at that time. And what we see in it, complete silence of God. Complete silence. There is no thing that is saying at one point, here God is coming to intervene and say everything's going to be fine. It's complete, and it is in the dark. You know, it's not only, it's in the dark. So there is more than that. And most importantly, the friends who are around, they are sleeping. You know, when you sleep, when somebody is suffering, that means I am not concerned, it's not my business. So the writer is really writing that he's lonely, he's suffering by himself, and anyone who has suffered knows that loneliness, where everybody is around you, and you are still alone, suffering alone. Complete and total silence of God. And what is the last word of Jesus Christ before he went to he died? Why have you abandoned me? If you have not experienced that, I have experienced it. Where you look at God and say, why have you abandoned me? Because when suffering does not make sense, when you say, how this is happening to me? And God, you know everything. You know everything. Why don't you intervene so that this suffering goes away? Why have you abandoned me? But that was not the last word. That was not the last word of Jesus. The last really word of Jesus was, not my will, but your will be done. And the Holy Father is asking us that we too, when we experience such a great suffering, that our words will be of that total submission to the will of God. And if we can indeed submit ourselves to that will of God, then we become co-heirs with Christ. We offer our unbearable suffering to Christ, and it makes us co-redeemer with Christ. I thank you.